Hi everybody, it's your AP Biology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are doing our final recap of AP Biology, and that will be on Unit 8. And here's the topics that we are going to discuss in Unit 8, which is on ecology. 8.1, responses to the environment. 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems. 8.3, population ecology. 8.4, the effect of density on populations. 8.5, community ecology. 8.6, biodiversity. And 8.7, disruptions to ecosystems. Without further ado, let's get this thing going. 8.1 is on responses to the environment. And guess what? All living things must be able to respond to environmental stimuli. That is one of the 7 requirements that living things have in order for us to call them living things. If there's something that changes in their environment or internally, they need to be able to respond to that. You got to be able to do it to be a living thing. And living things carry this out in 2 main ways: through physiological changes or through behavior. And we're going to talk about each of those briefly. So, some examples of physiological changes that some organisms make to adapt to their environment. My favorite is what's called the fight or flight response. You may have heard of this from like a psychology class or like a health class or something like that, but it's basically an animal's way of responding to something that would be threatening, and preparing their body in such a way that they're ready to fight for their life or run for their life, hence fight or flight. And this is commonly associated with neurotransmitters like adrenaline, aka norepinephrine and epinephrine. Your heart rate's going to go up, your awareness is going to go up, your digestion is going to go down, your blood pressure is going to go up, your breathing rate's going to go up, and you're going to be ready to take action. All right. So in other words, this is called being stressed out. That's a physiological change. All right, and here's some other examples. Acacia trees and other types of trees are able to change their physiology or change their bodily functions in such a way to repel herbivores from eating them any further. Same kind of thing with poison dart frogs. We can have 2 examples. One, they produce a physiological change in their toxins whenever threatened by a predator, so that if the predator tries to eat them, they taste really bad and the predator is going to die. And that's what actually this coloration, the brightly colored skin of poison dart frogs, kind of signals to predators. It's a way of communicating, hey, don't eat me, I'll kill you if you try to eat me. So there you go. That's another form of communication. All right. But a lot of organisms communicate with each other, and this is a form of behavior for reproductive success. And I have a list of them. Bees, big cats, wolves or pack animals, and birds in a lot of cases have for success. Bees have to communicate with each other where the best flowers to find pollen are, or to find food to feed their young, nourish their queen, and keep the colony going. They have to be able to communicate where certain flowers are. Maybe if there's a threat to the colony, they all have to work together and communicate in order to survive. And this communication enhances their reproductive success. It's actually amazing. You just Google bees waggle dance, then you're going to find out the amazing math that they have to do in order to give the precise location to their friends of where flowers are. They have to do some crazy stuff. All right, just Google it. Big cats, okay, they have to communicate with each other. They communicate through each other with smells, usually pheromones. All right, so cats, they pee on stuff, right? That's what they do, right? And that's a form of communication with other cats to maybe avoid competition, avoid territoriality. Like, hey, I'm here. This is my area. I don't want to have to fight you, because that's not good for anybody. Wolves and pack animals, they have to work together similar to bees. And there's a social hierarchy that's established through communication from pack animals like that. And mating dances and mating songs in birds are a form of communication. So these are traits that have evolved, or behaviors that have evolved through sexual selection. They're going to a better dance or a more appealing song is going to better attract a mate than others, right? And whoever has the best dance or the best song is going to be the one that has the mates, right? So that trait has been passed down through sexual selection. But it is nonetheless a form of communication that enhances reproductive success. Some other behaviors that are going to increase survival chances and reproductive success are grouping behaviors, particularly cooperative behaviors. So look at these ants. Ants are the quintessential animal of cooperative behaviors. They're able to do amazing things. If you've ever seen the I don't know how to pronounce it, Kurzgesagt, I think, in a nutshell videos, there's a whole series on ants and their reproductive success, or excuse me, their enhancement of reproductive success through their behaviors. It's actually incredible. But they have to cooperate, right? And sardines and birds, they often flock together in large groups because this cooperative behavior, they're kind of clumping together in very dense populations, actually increases the survival chances of individual fish from, say, like getting eaten by dolphins and sharks and all that kind of stuff, and birds, for example. So yeah, predation, avoiding predation is really helpful through cooperative behavior as well. All right, so that's 8.1. 8.2 is on the energy flow through ecosystems. So we're kind of taking a little bit of a pivot here, but this is some quintessential biology stuff right here that we're going to talk about. So another requirement of living things, in addition to being able to respond to environmental stimuli, they also must obtain and use energy. All right, that's Unit 3 stuff. We talked about that. All right, something else in Unit 3 we talked about is that all living things require a net gain of energy. That means they need to gain more energy than they're putting out, otherwise they die, pretty much, right? So when input is greater than output, growth and storage occur. When input is less than output, loss of mass and death occur. So you need to obtain more energy than you use if you're a living thing. That's a requirement of being a living thing. Some organisms have to obtain more energy than others based on their reproductive cycle or based on their metabolism, based on their body plans even. So here's two examples of organisms that have different energy requirements. Endotherms, like us, we are what are called warm-blooded. We use our metabolism, we use chemical reactions in our bodies to maintain our body temperature, all right, which is pretty cool, right? You don't have to go bask out in the sun. Maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe. Okay, but you don't have to go bask out in the sun to make sure that your body stays at its stable 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, right? Your metabolism is going to do that for you. So you eat a lot of food and you use a lot of energy to maintain your body temperature. But that's not the case for all sorts of animals. Ectotherms, like cold-blooded animals, like this shark over here, because the whale is warm-blooded. It's a mammal. It evolved from land animals, right? But this shark is cold-blooded. It has to use behaviors in order to regulate its temperature. So you might have heard that a shark needs to keep moving constantly, right? One of those reasons is to get water past its gills because it can't really move its gills on its own. But the other reason is to keep it moving and contract its muscles so that it can maintain its body temperature. There's no internal temperature mechanism like endotherms have in a cold-blooded animal. So lizards might go bask out in the sun to try and raise their body temperature. Another reason for energy requirement differences might be reproductive strategies. Okay, so these rabbits over here, well, they're going to reproduce like rabbits do. They're going to have a lot of babies in a very short gestational period, and they're going to, just reproduce. All right, there's a lot of energy available at their trophic level, which we're going to look at in a second here. There's a lot of energy available to them because they are herbivores, and plants have a lot of energy available to them. We're going to look at a tree here in a second. And these bears, they're rather large animals, right? And therefore they're going to require more energy. But they're not going to produce as many offspring, right? So like mama bear is only going to make a few cubs, maybe like once every 2 years, maybe. But that's not the case with these rabbits. But right, the bears are going to be some top predators, right? There's less energy available to them. They're going to be at the top of the trophic pyramid, and we're going to get a good image of why that is here in a second. All right, but we can categorize all living things into two groups based on how they maintain or how they obtain energy. Autotrophs obtain energy from non-living physical or chemical sources in their environment, like plants, for example. Those are photoautotrophs. All right, they're going to get their energy from a non-living source, which is light. Okay, but that's not the case for all organisms. So actually, check this out. This is a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean. The communities of organisms around a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean are some of the most biodiverse in the entire world. Right, so they have a thriving ecosystem with thriving energy flows, but there's no light at all. So how is this possible? Well, it's possible through what are called chemoautotrophs, which some archaea and some bacteria. These are single-celled organisms that are able to obtain energy from small inorganic molecules. So they have the metabolism, they have the capability to obtain energy, obtain ATP from otherwise inorganic, completely, inorganic molecules, right? The ones that they do not get from other living things. Okay, so these chemoautotrophs are able to support an entire ecosystem in the same way that plants do, but without light. It's kind of cool. Speaking of getting energy from molecules, heterotrophs are those that obtain it from molecules got from other living sources. They get from organic molecules from other living sources. And these are your animals and animal-like protists, like this amoeba over here, and fungi. So fungi are actually heterotrophs as well, right? They're going to use compounds from once living things or the waste from living things in order to, metabolize, all right, and to obtain their energy. So they are heterotrophs as well. Okay, but an important thing to note about autotrophs and heterotrophs is that they exchange matter and energy in an ecosystem. Both play a very crucial role in an ecosystem. In a diagram that's going to show these relationships, there's a few of them. One is called a trophic pyramid, and another is called a food chain or food web. But one thing to know in particular about ecosystems is that no matter what, matter cycles, like think of your carbon cycle and oxygen cycle, getting passed from one organism to the environment, back to another organism, so on and so forth. Matter cycles and is not created or destroyed, and energy flows through an ecosystem. Neither of these defy the laws of physics, defy the laws of the conservation of mass and energy. Matter is not created in an ecosystem, energy is not created in an ecosystem, and neither are destroyed either. But how this works, right, is that one group called the producers obtain the most energy from a non-living source. Then the consumers eat the producers to obtain their energy, and other consumers eat those consumers, and it's what we call a food web. Energy gets transferred in a one-way flow from a non-living source to a producer to a consumer, and so on and so forth. Right? But we're not really getting into matter cycling, okay? But matter cycles between these, right? So compounds are exchanged, but energy flows, and that's our focus for this topic. Energy flow is unidirectional, which means that it's not going to get passed back from one to another, and it's inefficient. Why is it inefficient? I'll show you here in a second. But primary producers, like I mentioned before, these are the autotrophs that are going to be using a non-living energy source to make it accessible for themselves, to make that energy accessible for themselves and the rest of the consumers in the ecosystem. So are they important? Yes, super duper duper important. And you can quote me on that. All right, they provide usable energy for the rest of the living things in an ecosystem. Consumers, well, like us, what are we going to do? We are going to consume other living things in order to obtain our energy, right? You could be an omnivore and consume plants and animals, right? Or you could be a herbivore and just consume the plants. You could be a carnivore and just consume other animals, right? Same thing. You're all consumers because you have to eat another living thing to get your energy. And how we describe these are through what are called trophic levels, and they describe how a group of organisms obtain its energy in a particular ecosystem, right? So these primary consumers, they're going to be consuming the producers. Secondary consumers are going to consume the primary consumers, and so on and so forth, right? So the top of our food chain over here, the top of our trophic pyramid, there's the least energy available to them, right? Because they are going to be only eating the tertiary consumers, right? But check this out. Only 10%, this is why it's inefficient, right? 10% of energy is passed from one trophic level to another, right? So if we had a system where we were trying to transfer energy and we're like a man-made artificial system and only 10% of energy was passed from one source to the next, like we would throw that machine out. We would throw that system out. It's very inefficient, right? And here's why that happens. Of the energy available to producers, primary consumers by eating the producers only get about 10% of that energy. Okay? And that trend continues through every trophic level. That's why we have it as a pyramid, right? Because it's widest at the bottom and narrow at the top, right? So it represents that there's a whole lot of energy at the bottom, but not a ton at the top, right? So for every level that we go up, right? A rat eats a grasshopper, it only gains 10% of that grasshopper's energy. And the grasshopper only got 10% of the grass's energy, all right? So we go down by a factor of 90 every single time. So there's very little energy available to the eagle, right? If we wanted to do some math, right? If if we're talking about the eagle obtaining energy from grass, an eagle doesn't eat grass; it eats things that eat things that eat things that eat the grass, right? It would only get, all right. So that's 10%, 1%, 0.1%, 0.01%. Okay, so that's why there's not many quaternary consumers in an ecosystem, because there's so little energy available to them. All right, another diagram that we can use to show energy flow is through a food chain and a food web. Okay, and this is pretty, you've probably seen these before. These are diagrams that are showing what eats what and what transfers energy to what. Right, so you can see the arrow going from the skunk to the vulture, for example, not because the skunk eats the vulture, but because the vulture eats the skunk, and therefore energy is being passed from the skunk to the vulture. And a change in energy availability can lead to, in an ecosystem, can lead to its collapse, right? So if I remove some of the populations from this ecosystem, it's going to kind of have a ripple effect on the rest of the ecosystem. So the food webs are providing us with a complex picture of energy transfer, and we can pick out, all right, what exactly would be the effect of removing or greatly decreasing or greatly increasing a certain population, right? So if we got rid of this caracal, for example, what effect might that have on the rest of the ecosystem? Well, if there were no caracals, there'd probably be more snakes. If there were more snakes, there might be more baboons, right? But if there's no caracals, there's probably going to be more, or no, excuse me. Yeah, if there's no caracals, there's going to be more rats. And if there's more rats, there might be less grass. And if there's less grass, there might be less grasshoppers. And it might have this huge effect on the ecosystem. So as I put down here, ecosystem stability depends on interconnectedness of populations in an ecosystem. And I would like you to hold that thought about ecosystem stability because we're going to come back to it at the end of this video. 8.3 is on population ecology, okay? 8.3 and 8.4 are about a population ecology. And what is a population? It's a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Like this flock of starlings, for example. They're all the same species. They live together in the same space. It's a population. What 8.3 and 8.4 are on are population ecology, which is analyzing factors that affect changes in the size of a population. Okay, so we were just looking at in that ecosystem, what would happen if that population went up or down, right? And this is the study of how that population goes up or down. So two main factors in whether or not a population grows or declines, birth rate and death rate. Are there more individuals born than die? Then the population is growing. If there's more individuals dying than being born, then the population is declining. And here's the thing about population growth. It's not indefinite. It can't just grow forever. There's a little bit of math to show when it does, when it starts to go in that direction, but it cannot go forever. And those are what are called limiting factors. The reason for that is what are called limiting factors. Those are going to prevent a population from growing indefinitely, right? Birds will be born and birds will be eaten by cats. That's just the way of life, right? So limiting factors go into two categories. There's density dependent and there's density independent. Density dependent limiting factors, as I put here, limit the growth of a population, decreasing B or increasing D, depending on how dense a population is. So population density is how many individuals are living in a particular area, right? So a very densely populated area would be like eastern United States. There's a lot of people in a small place, right? Or in India or China, for example. Very sparsely populated or low population density would be like the western United States or Siberia. You know, there's a large area and not a whole lot of people living there, right? So that's a low density. Okay, so density dependent limiting factors, these are going to be things that happen the more dense a population becomes, the more packed in everybody becomes. And these are things like competition, all right, competing with each other for resources, predation. Predators are going to be more likely to swoop in and get them if they're more packed in. Disease, those are going to get passed around. Parasites are going to get passed around more easily in a dense population. And territoriality, it has to tie in kind of with competition, right? We have territorial animals that needs their space in order to have reproductive success, then there's going to be problems and there's going to be limitations the more dense a population becomes. All right, but a density-independent limiting factor is one that is going to limit population growth regardless of the density of a population. It doesn't matter how dense or how sparse the population is, this is going to cause a limit. And these would be things like natural disasters, habitat loss through human intervention, extreme weather, or any other human-caused phenomenon, really. We're going to get back to that, though. Be ready, all right? So those are density-dependent and density-independent limiting factors, and both are going to have an impact on population dynamics, which is how a population grows and declines over time. So here's your basic equation. dn over dt, this is what we use to represent the growth rate of a population. B is the variable that we use for birth rate, and D is what we use for death rate. Right? So as I said before, if D is higher than B, then you're going to have a negative growth rate. If B is higher than D, you're going to have a positive growth rate. Right? Pretty simple math. It gets a little more complicated when we talk about there are two types of growth. One is what we call exponential growth. It's something that you have probably heard before. And that's rapid growth when a population reproduces without limits. All right, well, didn't we just say that there's limits? Yes, there are. Okay, but populations do experience exponential growth until they hit those limits. All right, and exponential growth curves are characterized by being a J-shaped curve. So it goes whoop. You've seen it before, I guarantee it. And exponential growth mathematically is defined by being a growth of a constant proportion in each time interval. And here's the equation for exponential growth. We have dn over dt, which is growth rate, equals R max, the maximum per capita rate of increase, times population size. And what is per capita rate of increase? Well, it's basically the number that we use to describe how much the population is growing per individual. All right, and I'll show you a little bit of equation. It's here to demonstrate what that means. Okay, but this is what exponential growth looks like, right? There's a J-shaped curve, and this is what logistic growth looks like, and we're going to get to that in a second here. But yeah, okay, really quick. Per capita rate of increase, okay, R times N. R is defined as basically, like I said, how many or how much is the population growing per individual. So I thought I had an equation in here. Yeah, here we go. Growth rate per individual, the proportion of growth per individual in the population. The higher the R, the more the exponential growth, or the faster exponential growth is occurring. All right, and here's how you would find R. It would be B minus D divided by the initial population size. Okay, so how much is it growing per individual? Basically, how many more individuals is each individual producing, in other words, in a population, if that makes sense. Okay, but it's a pretty simple equation. All right, I have some practice problems that are listed in, I believe, my 8.3 video. So if you need some practice problems, go ahead and check those out. I'm going to keep going because I only got about 20 more minutes to wrap up this video. 8.4 is on the effective density of populations, and this is when we're not growing exponentially, when we're growing with a logistic growth curve. So populations do have growth limits, as I mentioned. No population can grow exponentially indefinitely due to limiting factors. And what limiting factors make is called a carrying capacity, and that is the maximum population size. That is a number that an environment can sustain. Okay, and the carrying capacity is usually characterized by a horizontal line. Like this is basically the limit. The population should not go higher than this. And when it does, okay, when we get that growth curve where it starts to rise exponentially and then kind of taper off as it approaches carrying capacity, that is what we call logistic growth. As I said, it slows down, and as it approaches zero, the closer the population gets to carrying capacity. All right, and that is characterized by an S-shaped curve. So that's easy to tell the difference between exponential and logistic graphically, okay, just because you can see the logistic growth curve slowing down. It's an S shape. Here's the equation for logistic growth, okay? This time it's a little different. It's similar, but it's a little different from what we saw with the exponential growth. Here's R times N, right, the per capita rate of increase times population size, but then we got something else going on here. K minus N, the carrying capacity, minus the population size. So basically the difference between what the population is currently at and the carrying capacity divided by the carrying capacity. And that is going to give us our logistic growth rate. So the closer the population size, N, comes to carrying capacity, right, the smaller this number is going to be, and therefore the population growth is going to be slower and slower and slower. Okay, and again, I have example problems in 8.4. I encourage you to check those out if you need some practice using that calculation. All right, but I'm going to keep going, talking more about logistic growth. Population overshoot. All right, this is what we see when we have a carrying capacity and a population is growing exponentially and it goes over the carrying capacity. So when a population exceeds carrying capacity and it leads to a die-off, right? And this is a characteristic. This graph is characteristic of overshoot, right? So check it out. Here's a carrying capacity. We're growing exponentially. It goes over the carrying capacity, right? And then a lot of kind of individuals die, and it goes under carrying capacity. And since it's under carrying capacity, it's going to grow again, and then die off, and it's going to continue that pattern until it kind of evens out at carrying capacity. All right, so something to note about overshoot is that environmental destruction and human intervention can degrade carrying capacity and the overall population, right? So here's the thing. If we go way above carrying capacity with a population, it might degrade the environment and make less resources available for everybody, and therefore decrease the carrying capacity overall. And that means, well, you're going to have a much stronger die-off, right? And your population is going to grow even slower thanks to that lower carrying capacity. All right, but as I said, population size tend to fluctuate around carrying capacity. All right, and again, if we mess up the environment, the carrying capacity goes down. All right, and populations do not have the ability to grow as quickly. All right, now pivoting away from population ecology, and we're going to community ecology, and this is another level. I got the levels um, of ecology, okay, the levels of study in biology. I got them on another slide. You'll see here in a sec. All right, but now we're talking about a community, so we're getting away from populations, and we're talking about how populations interact with each other. So a community is a group of populations living in the same area at the same time, and therefore community ecology is the study of the interactions of multiple populations of different species in an area, and basically answering the question of how does it affect community structure and organization. How do those interacting populations affect the ecosystem? How do they affect each other? All right, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this topic. All right, and there's the Serengeti over there with multiple populations, so I wanted to show you that. But community structure, all right, a healthy community, one that is going to survive environmental changes, takes in two factors: the species composition, how much of there is there of an individual species, and how many species are there, right, and how abundant are those species, how many individuals are in each population of that species. Um, no, that's diversity. I'm sorry. Wow. Okay, scratch what I just said. Species composition or abundance is how many individuals there are in a species, in a population. Species diversity is the number of overall species. Okay, sorry about that. But we do a little bit of math to determine the community structure, and we use what's called, in AP Biology at least, we use what's called Simpson's Diversity Index, and that takes both factors, composition and diversity, into account. And here's the formula for that. So the diversity index, we use D sub S to represent that. Okay, equals 1 minus the sum of the number of organisms of a particular species divided by the total number of organisms of all species squared. All right, so it's kind of like chi-square, right, where you're doing one function a couple times, then you're adding them all together. It's 1 minus that, and then you could get Simpson's diversity index. I put a couple example problems on here if you want to try working these out yourself. I'm going to try and breeze through them a little bit because, again, this is a recap, right? And we're just touching on all the different topics. Go to 8.5, my 8.5 video. We can work this out with a little bit more detail, right? But if I have two communities, one has 15 individuals of species A, 25 of species B, and 5 of species C. All right, so I have three types of species, right? And then I have community 2. 35 individuals of species A, 4 individuals of species B, 5 individuals of species C, and 6 individuals of species D. Look at, I have 4 different species in community 2, 3 different species in community 1, right? But if we do a little bit of math with the Simpson's Diversity Index, which one might be more resilient to environmental changes, which one is healthier, in other words, which is a more vibrant kind of strong community? Well, it's actually going to be this one. Why? Because Simpson's Diversity Index takes not only diversity into account, it takes species abundance into account. So community 2 is showing you, oh, we do have more species, but there's less individuals, there's less abundance of those species, right? So like 35 individuals of species A making up most of the organisms in that community, right? That's what we call a dominant species, and that's not really necessarily a good thing. So DS is higher in community 1. All right, that's something I wanted to point out really quick. Okay, species must interact in a community in order to obtain matter and energy. Interspecies interactions include, and we're going to talk about each of them, competition, exploitation, and mutualism. All right, and we're going to talk about each of these briefly. Competition between species is never a good thing. All right, we don't want to compete for the same resources because that's going to, cause problems for everybody. So it is a negative and negative for both populations involved, both species involved. Exploitation is a type of interspecies interaction where one is harmed and the other is hurt. Okay, and then we're going to talk about a few examples of that. And then mutualism is a special kind where both species benefit from their interaction. All right, and then some of our favorite animal stories are examples of mutualism. All right, so competition is something that all species want to avoid at all times. Limited resources cause competition between species. Both species are harmed in an interaction where there's competition. Species avoid this through what's called niche partitioning. Similar species differentiate resources to coexist, right? So check out this picture of the Serengeti over here. You notice how the giraffes are like really tall and then the zebras are like kind of short, right? They have partitioned out their resources. They have evolved in separate ways so that the giraffes can have the high branches and eat the trees off the high branches, And the zebras and other animals that are smaller than them can have the ones off the low branches or the low bushes and shrubs and that kind of stuff. All right, that's a pretty good example of niche partitioning. They are both herbivores living in the same area at the same time, right? But they're able to coexist and differentiate their resources in a way that limits competition, which is a really good thing, okay? Because nobody wants competition. Exploitation. All right, this is the unfun one a little bit. One species is harmed and one is hurt, or excuse me, one is harmed and one benefits from harming that other organism. Predation is when a predator kills and eats prey, like the shark over here, right? Obviously, one species is harmed because it's eaten alive by a shark, right? Herbivory is actually a type of exploitation. An herbivore eats plants, right? That's not really good for the plants to get eaten either. So this field of grazing cattle is an example of herbivory. That is a type of exploitation, interspecies interaction. And then the third is called parasitism, which is really nasty, right? Parasite lives and feeds off of its host, right? It doesn't kill its host. Sometimes it does, but it tries not to kill its host and just kind of use it to survive off of, and that is a type of exploitation as well. One species benefits, the other is harmed. But our favorite one is mutualism, the interaction where both species benefit. So check out the classic Finding Nemo example, the clownfish and the anemone. The anemone gets kind of cleaned by the clownfish, and the clownfish gets protection from the anemone from predators. So both species are benefiting in that way. Similar to these rhinos over here and the oxpeckers. The oxpeckers are going to basically pick bugs and parasites off of the skin of the rhino and benefit from that. And guess what? The rhino doesn't have parasites and bugs on it anymore, which is, both species are benefiting. Commensalism is a kind of offshoot of mutualism a little bit. And that's an interspecies interaction where one species benefits and the other is just like, whatever. It's not harmed or helped. And I didn't put a picture of it, but some animals in the ocean kind of latch onto sharks. They're called remoras. They kind of latch onto a shark, and a shark just, does its thing and travels along, and that's it. It just hitches a ride off the shark, pretty much. It uses the shark's, mobility to get around, and shark doesn't really care. All right, 8.6 is on biodiversity. Let's talk more about ecosystems a little bit. All right, this is how we're kind of all putting it together. We've talked about organisms a lot in this class, right? 8.3 and 8.4 were on population ecology. 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems, was about that. 8.5, our last one was about communities. All right, and if we go higher than that, we go into biomes and into the biosphere. Biomes are very large areas like a tundra or deciduous forest, that kind of thing. And the biosphere represents all living things on the Earth, all ecosystems on the planet. But what an ecosystem is, consists of all the organisms in a given area and the non-living abiotic factors that they interact with. So communities, if you take a community, right, that's all the species, populations living together. If you throw in how these communities interact with their non-living environment, then you are studying what's called an ecosystem. And the study of ecology itself focuses on how living things interact with their environment. And a really, 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 really important factor when it comes to studying ecosystems is what's called biodiversity, and that's the variety of life. And this is something that we've talked about a couple other times in this class. Like biodiversity in a particular population is just like genetic variation. That's super important for a population to adapt to environmental changes. That was in our last recap video. If you haven't watched that, go check that out. But the variety in a population, in an ecosystem, is ultra, ultra, ultra important because of the same reason. Just the same reason why a population with very low genetic variation can't adapt to environmental changes, because there's nobody that has a better advantage for survival than others. It's the same thing when it comes to the variety of species, the variety of communities, the variety of interactions between species. It's the same thing. That ecosystem is going to be more resilient to changes and better at adapting. Functioning ecosystems have a lot of producers. Okay, so that's why, as I said before, the producers are at the bottom of the trophic pyramid because we need a lot. They're the ultimate source of energy for the rest of the consumers in the ecosystem, right? You might be a carnivore, right? But you're going to still eat things that eat plants. You still get your energy indirectly from plants and from producers. So producers, like photoautotrophs and plants, provide the energy for the entire ecosystem. Without them, there would be no ecosystem. There's no way to convert the non-living source of energy into one that living things can use through photosynthesis or through being a chemoautotroph. So they're very, very, very important. Okay, a couple other factors that go into the biodiversity and health of an ecosystem is the presence or absence of a dominant species. A dominant species is one that is most abundant in an ecosystem. And something that I was hoping to show you with those Simpson's diversity index practice problems is that a dominant species isn't usually great for an ecosystem. So I put ecosystems with a more dominant species might be less resilient to change. There's a lot of abundance of that species, but there's not, it's kind of affecting the diversity and the abundance of all the other species involved, right? So kangaroos, I've been told, are a dominant species, and reindeer in tundras are dominant species, which are, that could be a good or bad thing. Typically, it is not a great thing to have a dominant species. All right, another super important species, a member of a ecosystem, is what we call a keystone species. And your just perfect example of a keystone species is the gray wolf. And a keystone species is one that it might not be abundant, but it provides a critical role in maintaining an ecosystem balance. So a wolf is a top predator, right? It's a really important animal for lots of different ecosystems in North America, right? So fun story is that the ecosystems around Yellowstone National Park, they were not doing so great until the wolf was reintroduced. Wolves were eliminated because they were poached and hunted for hundreds of years. But once the wolf was reintroduced, the ecosystems began to thrive once again. And thereby, the gray wolf is what we call a keystone species. A keystone means that if you take it out, the structure collapses, right? So if you took out the wolves, the ecosystems were not going to do well. So eliminating, as I put here, eliminating keystone species may lead to ecosystem collapse. All right, last topic. Here we go. We got 6 minutes until my next class starts. 8.7 is on human interactions with biodiversity. Don't think that's a title. I think it's whatever. It's all right. It's about our impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. So 8.7, throughout life's history, natural selection has allowed species to become better adapted to their environments. All right, that's one of the big ideas of Unit 7 is that for 3.5 billion years of life, all right, natural selection has been happening, and living things have gotten pretty good at being adapted to their environment. Species are mostly well adapted due to those billions of years. But if we change environments too fast, like human beings are changing them now, it can really cause problems and pose threats to biodiversity. We just talked about how important biodiversity is, right? And endangered species are those that have been greatly affected by human-caused ecosystem disruptions. They're not quite able to adapt fast enough to the massive changes that we as in human beings are causing. And thus, we are causing what's called the world's 6th mass extinction. We talked about the other 5 in our natural selection unit. This is the 6th one happening right now. Some scientists have found that species are going extinct faster now than they did when, the asteroid crashed into the Earth and caused the Cretaceous extinction, which is terrifying, right? But here's why species are going extinct so fast. There are habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, and pollution. All right, if you want to try to remember all those 5, a good acronym that I have is called HIPCO, HIPCO. Habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, climate change, overexploitation. And we'll briefly kind of run through each of these. Habitat loss is the main one. It's the largest cause of biodiversity loss. Through urbanization and deforestation are primary drivers. Replacement of natural ecosystems with monocultures further increases vulnerability, right? So we're cutting down rainforests, which are the most biodiverse areas in the entire world, and we're replacing them with farms, which are in monoculture. Multiple, many of just one plant. What are we doing to the species diversity? We're replacing all that diversity with just one type of plant that you can hardly think of anything that would be worse for global biodiversity. Habitat loss also leads to what's called fragmentation. Okay, if I take a population, if I take a habitat and I cut it into pieces, I'm reducing the amount of gene flow, I'm reducing the genetic diversity, I'm reducing the size of gene pools of communities in that area. All right, and this graphic over here shows it pretty well. Species A is thereby, if we put a road here, we fragment that habitat. Species A is unable to interact with species B and species C, thereby limiting the diversity of all 3. Okay, urban expansion and urbanization leads to separation of already strained populations. So this road, for example, all right, that's an example of urbanization. The expansion of human settlements, human habitations is causing huge fragmentation, and that is just an accent on the top of habitat loss. Something else that's causing habitat loss is climate change. Yay, climate change. It accelerates habitat loss in that, the polar ice caps are melting. It causes changes in weather patterns. It causes changes in soil composition, ocean water pH, and temperatures. And those can all impact the effect that keystone species have. They can impact the producers and their functionality as the main source of energy in ecosystems. And it's just making everything go haywire. Arctic and Antarctic communities are currently the most affected. Here's the depressing picture of a polar bear. There are much more depressing pictures of polar bear. If you Google climate change in the Arctic, yeah, it's horrible. I didn't want to put it in here. But climate change is a huge one, hey, for driving biodiversity loss. It's almost as big as habitat loss. All right, the third is, did I skip one? The third is invasive species. You might have seen these lionfish around if you live in a certain tropical areas, and invasive species are those that did not evolve in an area that they're introduced to, and they outcompete native species for resources, right? So native species are specially adapted to their environment, right? They've spent their whole existence being adapted to this environment. Then you throw something else in that is completely not adapted to its environment. But sometimes that's a bad thing, but sometimes it's always a bad thing, but sometimes that species can't survive, but at other times there might be no natural predators or no natural herbivores for that species, and they might just take over, right? They just multiply and spread, and the native species can't keep up with that. Okay, so this plant over here is called Phragmites. It's a type of grass that just is completely taken over North America. You can see it everywhere, all right, and it's kind of choking out the native species that have existed here for millions and millions of years. And here's a lionfish, right? This is another example of a fish that is brought over and it's just kind of controlling everything and throwing off the ecosystem balance, throwing off the food web in many different ways. Uncontrolled population growth of invasive species alters ecosystem composition. All right, we got a few more. Overexploitation is another really good example. Overfishing is severely depleting fish populations and altering the ecosystem. All right, if you just, fish the crap out of the ocean, you take a whole ton of fish and you're just kind of destroying that ecosystem, destroying that part of the food web. Elimination of one piece can cause a ripple effect in the others, right? Overfishing is doing that in the ocean right now. Fish are disappearing. And on top of that, ocean plastic pollution is affecting water composition. It's putting microplastics into the water, and the little tiny microorganisms towards the bottom of the food chain, those primary consumers, are being affected by the amount of plastic in the ocean. And they are affecting marine food webs in a huge way. All right, last point here before my kids walk in is that human activities are primarily driving biodiversity loss, but natural causes can as well. There's been 5 previous mass extinctions. This one is anthropogenic. All right, and this image over here shows us really, really well how that's happening. Here's our hippo up here. It's causing a lower population, reduced adaptability, more genetic drift, reduced fitness, and that's what leads to extinction. And that's what's happening today. Yeah, geological and climatological changes have drastically altered the ecosystems, but we are doing the most of it right now. That is it for this video. That is it for the recaps. I know I went fast, but please let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.